All right, so let's get started with the week 2 lecture. So I'm going to, in week 2 and probably for the rest of the weeks, chunk these lectures up, these videos up into a bit shorter sections. So there will be more than one video that you have to watch, but each one will be shorter. Hopefully that will help people maybe structure their time a little bit better. They'll know, oh, I have a little bit of time now, I can watch the first part of it, and then you can sit there and maybe digest the first part of it and then move on to the next part. Usually they will be in two parts because we go over two arguments in most weeks. Sometimes they'll just be one shorter video. And I think I'll also post a third video, which is a sort of recap of the previous week. The recap won't be mandatory viewing. It will be there for people who are interested to hear some more maybe historical information about the third or the argument that you use for your individual summary and your group discussion. I will sort of sum up my impression of your interpretations of the argument by looking through your summaries, and then I will sort of say what people generally got right, what people generally got wrong, give some additional historical information, give you the sort of usual interpretation of that argument, that kind of thing. So certainly I encourage you to view those recap videos, which will sort of be an addendum to the week before, but I won't say that they're required. They will be helpful, though, if you want a more general understanding. So there are going to be probably more videos in week 2 than in most weeks. So there'll certainly be more than in week 1 because week 1 just had the long lecture videos, and then of course there was the long lecture video for the basic course documents. This week there will be 2 lecture videos, one for each of the arguments that are gone over in the lecture slides. There will be a recap of Nietzsche's argument and of generally what we went through in week 1. And then there's also going to be a 4th video. I know it's a lot, but that one I'm going to sort of talk about your icebreaker discussions, sort of give you a sense. I mean, you've already perhaps read some people's icebreaker contributions, but I'm going to give you a sense, having looked at all of them, of what people generally took philosophy to be and that kind of thing. And then I'm going to give my own view on it, tell you sort of what our working definition of philosophy will be for this course, and give you a little bit more information right there. So 4 video sections for week 2. The standard, I think, going forward will be 2 to 3 video sections each week. And each of them should be around, I want to say, 15 to 30 minutes. So the overall amount of video watching time that there will be in subsequent weeks ought to be roughly the same. I'm just going to divide it up a bit more because that's probably better for helping people in time management and keeping people's attention and that sort of thing. So we'll see how that works, and hopefully you all prefer that. So now let's get right into the next stuff. And just so that everyone is clear, this here, the content button, the content tab in this menu, you want to navigate to this and then go through the table of contents here to access all of the assignments and materials for the most part. You'll notice that there's a course checklist at the top of every week. That ought to update itself, I believe, as you go through things. Yeah, so once you click on the various readings and activities for the week, it should check off in the checklist. Why is that relevant? Well, you can look at this during a given week to make sure you've gotten everything for that week. But in terms of accessing future material, you'll notice that here all conditions must be met for you to view this, right? So I don't know if you can actually see these up here. I think that only I can see them. But course checklist week 1, see there are 3 things here that you have to have done to even see the week 2 material in the first place. So these checklists, they might be a little bit clunky, maybe you find them a little bit annoying, but it's to ensure that people are at least looking at all the things for each week so that no one's skipping anything, so that you're not allowed to accidentally skip something and get through the whole course and then at the end realize that, that there's a whole bunch of stuff that you missed. So on each week, week 2, reading sequence, lecture material, here is where you're going to find the reading list. Here's the link to your group discussions. Here's the link to the active reading Dropbox. Here's the link to the summary Dropbox. Here's the quiz, and then here's the checklist. And of course down here, these are the lecture slides. And this is also where I'll put the link for the lecture videos. Now, I haven't yet resolved the issue. I'm working with the ITS folks to sort of get the links working for everyone, because they work for me, they work for the people in ITS, so we're sort of having trouble figuring out why they're not working for students. But for the time being, I mean, if you're watching this video, you already know how to do it, obviously, but we're going to keep going from the A to Z list, clicking on integrity, because that seems to have worked for everyone so far. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so now we're in week 2. Week 2 is about philosophy of science. Okay, so let's get into that. All right. So this connects directly to week 1. We're not following the table of contents in order in our textbook, as you will already have noticed if you were looking at all for these things. But we are structuring it in a kind of thematic way. Not each week will connect to the one before, but numerous weeks they'll be usually in pairs and they'll connect to each other. That's the way that I've designed this course, so that it all doesn't seem like it's just, okay, this week we're talking about one thing, and then next week we're talking about something unrelated. Where possible, I've drawn connections between the topics. And so here, our segue from week 1. In week 1, we discussed Nietzsche's famous death of God argument, right? So the interpretation presented in the textbook and the generally accepted interpretation is, of course, that not that any actual entity died, right? That there was something, named God, and that thing died, and that human beings killed it somehow, literally. It's metaphorical. What is being talked about is the idea that the concept of God was invoked less and less over time to explain everyday things. So Nietzsche's idea is that before the sort of advent of scientific method and some non-theistic versions of philosophy, whenever you needed to explain anything, or at least in his European context, in the medieval European context, people invoked God. God was the reason that absolutely anything happened. However, scientific inquiry now starts saying, well, the reason that this happens is these natural laws. It doesn't directly invoke God. Moral things are starting not to invoke directly God. And so that's what Nietzsche means by the death of God. The concept starts to fall into relative disuse, which is not to say that during his time no one believed in God. Surely in his context, so this is 19th century Germany, lots of Europeans still believed in God. But he's saying, relatively speaking, this amount of belief and the use to which that belief was put in everyday life has sort of decreased. Now, this left a vacuum caused by, what I say, increasing atheism and naturalism. Theistic belief started to seem to people to be irrational and was replaced with scientific belief in naturalism, which is purported to be more rational, right? Based on observations, on facts, on arguments, rather than faith. Nietzsche argues, contrary to what I've just said, that scientific and naturalistic belief is not more rational than theistic belief. It is indeed equally irrational. One is not better than the other in terms of its sort of being secured to the truth. They are equally based on some kind of assumption, right? So Nietzsche's claim is that, that the death of God has sort of left this vacuum and hasn't really filled it, right? Because people don't think that their belief in science, their belief in naturalism, serves the same role, the same sort of solidifying role as the concept of God. But according to Nietzsche, it actually does. Now, what we're going to look at are some more contemporary arguments from the 20th century about whether or not science progresses rationally, right? So it's philosophy of science because it's talking about how science works, what science does, whether or not it progresses rationally. The two arguments that we're going to look at today say that it does progress rationally. And then the one that you are all going to discuss from the textbook says that it's not as clear that it progresses rationally. So the argument in the textbook from Kuhn does not say that sort of science is just the same as any other belief system necessarily. So we're still departing from what Nietzsche seems to say here. Okay, so let's get into the first argument. Well, actually, let's talk about philosophy of science first. So philosophy of science is a subdiscipline of philosophy, which is kind of under the heading of epistemology. Epistemology being the sets of questions, sets of philosophical questions dealing with knowledge. How is knowledge different than sort of, just a random true guess? When do we have knowledge? How do we get knowledge? What counts as good evidence for beliefs? And that sort of thing. So, in particular, philosophy of science evaluates the epistemic status of scientific claims to knowledge. That is, how does scientific practice support scientific beliefs? What kind of evidence does it use? How sure and certain is that sort of evidence? So on and so forth. And one of the big questions in philosophy of science is the question of progress, which is, as I've stated here, does science move mostly forward toward an accurate picture of how the universe objectively works? That is, when science succeeds, do we figure out the way things are independent of people's particular opinions about how they work? And there are broadly two positions here. Realism about science says, yes, science does progress mostly towards a more accurate picture of how the universe works. Anti-realism says, no, it doesn't. And anti-realism might say, no, it doesn't, even though it's trying to, right? It says science takes itself to be doing this, but fails. Anti-realism might also say, science doesn't even take itself to be moving forward towards an accurate picture. It's instead just trying to equip us to do stuff, right? It doesn't really care whether it's providing a true picture of the universe. It just cares whether it's allowing us to intervene on the universe in ways that suit our human interests. So there's a lot more to say about the difference between realism and anti-realism. We're not going to get into that so much. We are mostly just going to, I said this to give you a framework to understand the philosophy of science. All right. So the first argument we're going to look at is from Hilary Putnam. So Hilary Putnam died only recently. He was an American philosopher who wrote very widely. He's very well known, well respected in American and analytic philosophy. And he wrote a lot on philosophy of science. That was sort of initially what he worked on. Later he worked on philosophy of language. And then finally, in his later years, he worked on sort of philosophy of society, which revisited issues of philosophy and language and science. But what makes him particularly well-known, perhaps infamous, is that he was sort of constantly changing his mind. There would be points in which he would cite his own work, his own earlier papers, only to disagree with them, basically. Why do I say that? I say that just to tell you that the argument that we're going to look at from Putnam today is not an argument which he would have endorsed at the end of his life. This was an argument he made much earlier on in his career, and I'm pretty sure that he explicitly rejects it, repudiates it later on in his life. That doesn't mean the argument is wrong. That doesn't mean it's no good. That just means he stopped being persuaded by it. And that's an important thing to note. an argument is independent from the person putting it forward, from the author of that argument. Now, the author may be putting it forward for particular reasons, and they may be subject to particular biases which make them put that argument forward, but you can separate the argument from the person making it. The reasons why they're making it don't necessarily mean that it's right or wrong, so on and so forth. So the no miracles argument, as it's called, might actually be correct, even though Putnam stopped thinking it was correct. It may just be that for some reason, he became more wrong as he went on in life rather than more right. We're not going to get into too much interpretation in that way. So what is this so-called no miracles argument? Well, it's a scientific realist argument, right? So it's a realism argument. It says, yes, science does progress by moving mostly forward towards an accurate picture of the way the universe actually works. It's a very short argument. So it's two premises and a conclusion, just like the Kalam argument that we looked at last week. And here's how it goes. Premise 1. If a scientific theory yields accurate observational predictions, then it must be at least approximately true. Premise 2. Many of our scientific theories yield accurate observational predictions. Conclusion 1. Many of our scientific theories must be at least approximately true. Otherwise, the success of science would be miraculous. So this is where the no miracles name comes from. So there it is. It's pretty short. Well, what does this mean? First premise, if a scientific theory yields accurate observational predictions, then it must be at least approximately true. So the idea here is that what we do with our scientific theories is we try and figure things out so that we can, build better machines, make new drugs, whatever, right? All kinds of practical applications, or so that we can simply predict phenomenon, right? So a scientific theory might let us build something new. It might let us predict the weather farther out into the future. It might let us understand how, the sun works, all these sorts of things. There's a whole variety of feats that scientific theories facilitate us doing. So if these theories successfully do that, if they allow us to predict new things, manipulate things, build stuff, then that theory must be getting something right. Okay? If it were totally wrong, we wouldn't expect that we could use it to build a bridge, make a new drug, predict the weather. We'd expect that our success on the basis of an incorrect theory would be at best 50%, like a coin flip. As a specific example, I say, if I successfully disassemble and reassemble my computer frequently and it works after each reassembly, then whatever my theory of how the parts go together is, it must be mostly right. So notice that we're saying approximately true, mostly right. Just because we succeed at doing something on the basis of a theory doesn't mean every last statement that theory makes must be, exactly true. We allow for there to be some gaps, some little bits here and there that are slightly off, inaccurate, maybe one or two statements that is completely false, but we're not going to worry too much about that. So approximately true. It gets it mostly right. Okay? So that's the first premise. So this, again, seems pretty intuitive, right? I imagine that you all don't have a hard time agreeing with the idea that if I use some understanding of something successfully to do practical stuff, then my understanding must be more or less right. But I just talked about this phrase, approximately true, and notice that it's something of a weasel phrase. That is, you can use it, you can lean on the kind of vagueness inherent in the word approximate to kind of get away from objections in a sneaky kind of way. So we don't have a specific idea of how much of a theory has to be true, right? Is it 51%? Is it 2/3? How much counts as sort of being approximately true? Which parts of it are most important, that need to be true in order for the theory to count as approximately true, because in a given theory, not every statement is sort of equally important to the theory. Some are more central, right? So think about a particular religious faith, right? It may not be as important that you have to refrain from eating meat during Lent. Whether or not that's true may not be important, but so we're talking about Catholicism or something. But that God exists, well, that's really important. That one has to be true. So we can't just talk about the relative number of statements which are true. We have to figure out which ones are most important, and then of course those have to be true. How do we figure out that those specific ones are true? Blah blah blah. So while the first premise is intuitively appealing, there are some possible difficulties with evaluating it. The second premise. So the first one, you'll notice, going back to here, is another one of these if-then statements, right? So this is another modus ponens argument, where you say, let me just annotate this briefly. So modus ponens, if you'll recall, is sort of if, and I'm sorry my handwriting with this is so terrible, if P, then Q, right? So that's this first part here. The second part says, well, guess what? P. And so because we had if P then Q, and then we demonstrate that P is true, we can conclude, hey, Q, right? So this is modus ponens again, just like before. All right. So 2 is providing for us the P of if P then Q, right? So many of our scientific theories do yield accurate observational predictions. So scientific theories allow us to do all kinds of things. We don't even appreciate on a day-to-day basis how much sort of, especially material science, stuff which develops chemicals and building materials, how much that has advanced over time in a relatively short period of time, and how much that allows us to do, right? These sort of space-age materials that allow us to send things into space, that allow us to make very large but light constructions. So just think of an old-fashioned bicycle made from like steel. It's really heavy, and sort of carrying it anywhere would be a pain. Anyone who has, if anyone who cycles competitively, trying to cycle competitively in the Tour de France on a steel bike, well, you'd get tired faster because the bike weighs so much. But of course now, the bikes that the professionals use in the Tour de France are all carbon fiber. Not only are they lighter, but the way that the carbon fibers are sort of stacked on top of each other allows the energy transfer of from the cyclist to the cycle to be more efficient. So not only is it lighter, so they have to lug less weight around, the energy transfer is more efficient, so they can go farther faster. Okay, that kind of stuff, all over the place. Velcro, plastics, blah, blah, blah. So there are countless instances of how our scientific theories have yielded accurate observational predictions. We can predict, as we did, well, I didn't, we, as the human race, can predict very accurately the occurrence of solar eclipses, as was evidenced by the one at the end of August. So we have all of this support for premise 2 here, that many of our scientific theories do in fact do this. Okay. Well, okay, so if P, then Q, P, therefore Q, right? Many of our scientific theories, therefore, must be at least approximately true. Okay, so that's at least as much. So ignoring this for the moment, ignore this part, right? So this is how Q is stated in the original part of the argument, right? many of our scientific theories must be at least approximately true. So this addition here, otherwise the success of science would be miraculous. That's supposed to be, I guess, implied by they must be approximately true. If they weren't approximately true, then something really strange would be happening. Okay, so we have to unpack what the meaning of miraculous is here. The idea is that, well, look at every second of every day, what kinds of predictions and interventions our scientific theories allow us to do. Things which require incredible precision, or else things would fall apart, crash into each other, or blow up. That stuff is mundane to us. It happens constantly, right? Power plants don't constantly explode. Planes don't drop out of the sky all the time. Things get launched into space and don't run into all the crap that's orbiting the planet. That takes a lot of precision. And so our models must be getting things right. If all of that very minute and precise intervention and prediction happened, but it wasn't because we were getting things right, well, that would be very strange. Our success would be due to incredibly long streaks of luck, which are almost uninterrupted, right? Or to some sort of constant, undetectable intervention from outside sources. Like, we're trying real hard. Some aliens are up there seeing, well, everything's about to go terribly wrong, but they're trying so hard. Let's help them out. We'll just bump things around a little bit, okay, so that things don't constantly explode and kill everybody. That's what's meant by miraculous here. These alternate possibilities, namely that we're on incredibly long streaks of luck, or that some entity is constantly looking out for us, those are meant to be absurd possibilities that are sort of ruled out. Why are they ruled out? Well, because they posit the existence of implausible entities, or of statistically improbable, like not quite impossible, but so improbable as to virtually be impossible sorts of strings of events. So the existence of aliens or of sort of divine beings constantly intervening, those are things which have to be proven. We can't just bring them out of nowhere to use in an explanation. So we would have to add another premise, something like many of our scientific, so we'd have to go back and say, if a scientific theory yields accurate observational predictions, then either it must be approximately true, or there is some divine being constantly looking out for us, or we have an incredibly long streak of luck, right? So then we'd have a different type of argument. Then, once we demonstrate that our scientific theory yields accurate observational predictions, we would have 3 possible conclusions, not just the one. And so we'd have to go and see which one of them is more likely. So we'd have more work to do. And so the idea is that it doesn't really take any work for this, well, we're getting it right because, or we're succeeding because we're getting it right. That's the simplest explanation. So that's kind of why the alternatives are meant to be ridiculous. Okay, so this is where we're going to end the first section, and I will immediately start recording the next one for the second argument in this set of slides, but it will be a separate video, so you can watch them separately or whatever.